Hello? Make sure that they can hear me. Sorry, before we get started. The first one back in the room. Okay, let's test sound. Hey Victoria, how's it going? Welcome back. Talking probably pretty close to what I'd be speaking. A good volume. I can also up the gain. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Oh. Good, good. I hope everyone had a good week. Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between last week and this week in terms of HTML and how we're dealing with HTML. But mostly today we're going to be focusing on something called CSS. Has anyone not heard of CSS? I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous, right? Okay. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and they're used to apply the visual style to a layout, an HTML website. We can take HTML tags and apply different styles to different tags. So last week, we spent our time writing a web server mostly and learning HTTP. But in doing that, we had to also generate some HTML on the server that would get sent back to the client that the client would render on their browser. And I'm not sure how far some people took it. Some people may have added styles to these pages. It wasn't a requirement, but could have gotten, I guess, a little bit ahead if you wanted to, or if you'd already known some CSS. This week, we're going to look at a little bit of a different way to build a client application. And so instead of us making a request to the server and getting back a chunk of HTML and then rendering in the browser, what we'll do is we'll make, and if we want the page to change, we have to make another request to the server, get that back, and then we want somebody to change. Every time we submit a form, we're making a request, getting back a chunk of HTML. This week, we're going to be doing something called a single page application. We're going to be using this sort of an architecture where we make a request to the server, and it gives us back some HTML, but only just a little bit. And it also gives us back JavaScript, and that JavaScript is used to manipulate the DOM, the document object model. So whenever we make a request to the server is actually just giving us some data back. And then we use that data to perhaps add a list, maybe a UL, so an unordered list, and then some list items for each item in our data array that we get back. And this is what it looks like to the user is that the page is never actually refreshing, it's just changing. And this can be very useful for certain types of applications. Whereas I think some websites work really well using an older sort of request response, what we'd call like a CRUD style application, something where, I guess the main difference there is that we make a request and get HTML back every time. So although I don't have time to spend I don't have a lot of time to spend on that today. We will be tomorrow spending some time looking at how the DOM works and how to manipulate using JavaScript. So today is really just about CSS, and anything we learned today could really be applied to the stuff you did in TinyApp last week as well, if you wanted to. Okay. So this week, we're going to look at a project called Tweeter. It's if anyone guessed, it's a ripoff of Twitter. You have the ability to see a list of all the tweets that that are in the database, and then when you type into the form field, it keeps track of how many characters you've typed so far, because we have a limit of 140. And so when you click the submit button to post, it doesn't actually refresh the whole page. What happens is a message is sent to the server updates, and you retrieve that new data and then just manipulate the DOM. So change the HTML that's in there dynamically. Single page application, we need to learn both of these things because they're both out there in the wild, and I don't think there's one sort of dominant method. I think that they're both pretty equivalent. I think maybe we're moving more towards single page applications with technologies like React, but there's still a lot of Rails sites out there that use sort of an older request response, send HTML every time. So we need to learn both these things. And in order to do that, let's just make sure I'm checking my notes. So I didn't mention that I'm probably not the best person to be teaching CSS. It's not something I spend a lot of time doing professionally. It's something that I don't know that people should be paying me to do it, because I'm not a professional. But I want to get good at it because it's one of those technologies that you can avoid and only do parts of development that you don't really need to worry about styling. You can work on the back end only, you can do databases. But if you do it, it's really important to do it well, because if you don't, it doesn't scale. And you can build a simple site very easily, but a complex site with multiple people working on it at the same time, that really takes a lot of design and architecture behind the styles. You can get yourself caught pretty quickly, and you change one thing over here, and now this other thing's out of alignment, and then you go and change that back, and now you're working against it. To learn CSS well is to work with it, to understand the benefits. And so I haven't done this lecture in a while either, and I just want to make sure that I know what I cover everything, so I'm going to be checking my notes and just making sure I get through each section without missing anything important. Okay. That being said, I think I can do a pretty good job at teaching a basic level of CSS. And I learned a lot when I was starting to prepare this myself about the actual details of how these things work. I used them before, and you can get away with that. But now I kind of feel like, okay, now I know when to use this versus this. And I'll show you that dichotomy later. Okay, so back to the actual lesson, and now that I got that off my chest. It's week 3, so we're going to expect that people spend a little bit more time with documentation. It's sort of built into the assignments now, where you'll be doing a lot of searching in the jQuery documentation this week. And you'll probably be doing a lot of searching on MDN for different CSS properties that you're going to need to use. It's just important that I call this out because I want people to be prepared. I don't want them to be caught off guard. And it's not like we bail on you. It's just a little bit less over time, right? So documentation reading is an art. It's something we get better at as well. And some docs are really bad and some are good, and it's important to recognize which are good and which are bad. I'll try and, if we have some time at the end, show you a little bit about how we can read documentation a little bit better, what to look for when we're trying to find good documentation. Because it turns out it's not actually the first result that's returned in a search query. It's not always that. Sometimes you'll notice that, for example, you do a search for something and you get W3 schools. at the top result. Well, they're really good at SEO, but you're going to want to look down that list and find the Microsoft or Mozilla developer stuff, or even a Microsoft documentation of the same type of content, right? So read documents before you ask questions. If you don't understand something in documentation, ask for help, and someone can come sit next to you and help read that paragraph and really understand maybe some of the words that you haven't learned, the terminology. That's fine too. Like, I think sitting down and helping you read some documentation, actually understand what you would have to learn on your own, is not a bad way to approach it. Right? Okay, that's out of the way too. I got about 5 minutes to teach HTML, and I hope that the weekend preparation and the prep course and stuff have prepared you for this 5-minute introduction and the rest of this week, really. We just don't have time to spend on it. But I want to talk a little bit about semantic HTML, because HTML has evolved over time, and we've got a bunch of new tags for HTML5, and you can get away with a lot when you're writing HTML. You can get away with not closing certain tags, and you can get away with using a tag that it says article, but you're using it for a navigation bar. I mean, you can do whatever you want, really. HTML is not super strict. So let's talk a little bit about this semantic stuff. This is a little bit meta, because I put my example today is the notes that I prepared for today, written as an HTML document with style applied to it. And so this is just a document. Like I said, I think last week, the web, when we were talking about HTTP, the web is designed for sharing documents, things like scientific documents. They didn't even have images for a very, very long time. And over time, we've started to move to a more kind of consumer-based internet, right? And that means that we need to actually make things look a little bit nicer too, because we need to attract people to our information, to our pages, to our sites. And so we've got this HTML. I've got styles applied to it. I did it all sort of from scratch, and I'm going to walk you through quickly some of the HTML that I've included in this site. Also, I kind of want to show, oops, oh, I got to re-enable that, I think. Let's see, Vim. Otherwise, I navigate like I'm drunk through my editor. Okay, so let's reload that. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to remove all the styling. You'll notice that I have these two links here. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can get styles into an HTML page, which we'll talk about after I've gone through a couple of these tags. And I just want to show you that this is sort of what the page would look like if I didn't apply any styles to it, right? It's totally easy to read, right? It's got all sorts of different context, headers and paragraphs and code blocks, right? It's these code blocks. No, syntax highlighting or something nice like that would be cool. But basic styling. So HTML, you're going to want to notice as well, naturally responsive. Right? It's our styles, it's us that make things unresponsive. So we need to keep that in mind, that by default, browsers give us responsive design. Although we don't want to put all our pages out like this, right? So we have to deal with this. So one way that I can include a style into some HTML is through this link tag here. And that is going to take a separate file. This one here is located in the exact same directory as my index.html, styles.css, right? So I can load it up by just pointing to that file. It's a relative path, so I didn't need to put any slashes or any other folders. It's in the same one. And when I do that, it will load the CSS at the point in time when it reads this, and then it'll apply the styles to my HTML once the DOM's loaded. Okay, so I've also got another way to do this. I can say style. So I can use an HTML tag to say that there's some styles I want to apply to this. And if I remove my pre-existing styles and I say that I want the body background color to be, that's white, isn't it? Don't want that. I don't know, something like 333. It's a dark gray. Now I get dark gray, right? So I can apply styles two different ways here so far, with a link tag that imports a file from external, or from a style tag embedded pretty much anywhere in my document. Okay. My recommendation is to use this process where we separate our things into files. It allows us to organize our more complicated styles. But you're going to see I've used this a little bit because sometimes it's just a little bit easier to put 3 or 4 styles in a document. It really depends on the scope of your project, how you choose what way you're going to load styles in. So 2 ways. We're going to have a third way as well. And this third way is right here in line. I can say that this thing has a style and that the background color, background, is going to be, I don't know, red or something like that. And so there it is. Third way to apply styles, right? Apply them with a link tag, inline in the header, or as a style tag, or right here. This I would recommend against using very often. It's very specific, and it can be useful sometimes, but it's also sort of an anti-pattern. Overuse of this would be an anti-pattern. We would say we don't want to do this very often because it doesn't leave a lot of maintenance or maintainability or flexibility in our code, in our CSS. So although we can do that, we want to reserve that for the critical situations. Okay. So a bunch of different tags here that I've used. At the entire document sits in a body tag, right? We've got this concept again of head and body. Very common, I think, in software development, right? We have our HTTP messages. They have headers and a body. Our HTML even has headers and a body. And head is really just non-visual content that is applied to this document, or non-visual maybe configuration. Some metadata can go in here. All that style, all those styles. The title of the page, arguably, that is something that's visual, right? We look at the top here. That's where the title shows up, but it's not a part of the document here. Right? It's not shown as HTML. So we're going to see that, yeah, some of these elements don't have any effect on the actual visual layout. So in the body, I've broken this up into a few pieces. I've got, oh, that's horrendous. Let's do this. I've got at the top, I've got the, I don't know, navigation maybe. Maybe I put a bunch of different links up top there. In this case, I've just got a link to the source code for this project. And then inside there, or then I've also got a main section, and I've put a little CSS on it, class center, to try and bring it into the center of my document. I've got a header, an H1, so there's different layers of headings that we can do, H1, H2 to H6. And these, again, HTML is all about providing context to our documents. So these headers are useful for that. We can also say that certain content is part of a paragraph, and that paragraph has, well, now is a good time as any to bring up this inspector, which everyone should use, right? This thing here, we can actually find out a lot of information about what's going on in here. For example, this paragraph tag that we're using here, it has a little bit of margin on the top and the bottom to separate it from the rest of the content. That's a good thing for a paragraph to do. It makes it easier to read. So I kind of roll through this. And as I do that, I can see which piece of the DOM this is actually representing. We've got an ordered list here with 2 list items, LI tags, each one containing the information for that list. An ordered list is going to default to being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whereas an unordered list will have dots instead, maybe. You can use an unordered list and tell it to use decimal numbers, and you can use an ordered list and tell it to use dots. It's not very semantic, though, right? So that's up to you to decide if you do it in a way that makes sense or not, because we have that flexibility. It's not strict. It's not enforced. Only enforced through code reviews, I think. Okay. So this HTML, pretty straightforward. You're going to notice in this document, which has way too much for me to go through today, but you can go through it, check out, it has most of the different tags that we might need, and even some interesting stuff like, what is this? Has anyone seen this stuff before in an HTML document? Yeah. It says here, and LT semicolon ampersand GT semicolon. These are HTML entities encoded in a way that we can display them on the page as if they were not being rendered as HTML. So what this is I'm trying to render a doc type tag, just like I do at the top here. This one actually gets interpreted by the HTML parser, or the HTML parser, and is converted into some piece of DOM. Whereas in this case here, we'll notice that I really just literally wanted to put these tags into the document so that you could see them. And so I can't say less than doc type, because now it's just thinking that's just HTML. So I have to do this HTML entity encoding for some of the elements that are reserved. Okay. So this one, LT, means less than. GT is greater than. Quote, the special kind of quote, the double quote, let's say. So this tag is less than HTML lang equals quote en for English, right? And then maybe you also have a situation like this where you want to do a forward slash. That's what that means. That's like the closing tag, forward slash. So it's this weird X2F. You don't have to remember these. No one remembers these. Don't bother. I remember ampersand. I remember greater than and less than because those are easy. But things like this, X2F, it's a hex value. It's just like, you can look up hex values if you want. It's not really part of this. HTML entities. This is what we want to be searching for when we run into these. And we'll see that the and, if we want to represent an ampersand, well, then we have to do ampersand amp to make that happen. And there's, ooh, W3 schools, no thanks. You did it. You made it to the top of Google. Congratulations. Yeah, yeah, there's like a few that don't, but man, it bothers me. Okay, this is a way better place. This is where I live. Okay. So you have these ones here that are the most common. Okay. And then you've also got many characters have memorable. For example, the entity for copyright symbol is copy. For less memorable characters, such as 8212 and X20, whatever, you can reference the chart or use a decoder tool. Actually, if I were writing maybe a documentation site, I would actually feed this stuff into a thing that can actually convert the entities for me. I wouldn't actually do it manually. Anyways, too much time on that. Oh, we suddenly started getting a pretty bad echo on my mic. Okay, let's fix that. Let's do a few things here. Testing. Okay. Let's see if this fan. We'll turn this off. I don't know if that's having some impact on it. Maybe this stuff too is in the way. Hello, can you hear? Is this better? I could also restart the mic if this isn't good enough. Still a bit of an echo. Okay. Maybe I will try and reduce the audio just a little bit. Is that better? Now I'm not getting a peak on the audio levels here, it seems. Okay, let me know if it gets to be too much, and I'll restart the mic and try other things like that. Thank you for being patient. Okay. So how do we feel about HTML? Pretty straightforward. Okay. We will get into how CSS applies to HTML, so we'll talk a little bit more about it. What I want to do as well is just show you in my documentation here. Actually, let me apply these styles again. In my documentation here, I've got this example basic HTML template that you could all use to start your own documents if you wanted to. I just pulled this off the website. This is sort of like a pretty good set of a starting template. And for each of the tags, I've actually put a little bit of information for each one of them. So for example, down here, this meta name viewport content device width stuff, that's needed for responsive design. So if we didn't do that, we might, when we put on other devices, it might not scale properly. So we want to make sure we get that into documents that we, and I think nowadays all documents should be viewable on mobile devices, just like they should be on the web. It's pretty frustrating when I go to a website on my phone and it's not, that it should be responsive, it just doesn't. It renders as this massive, like, zoomed out page. It's too bad, right? This is kind of all it might take to fix that. So I've applied these styles now, and I'm going to take a look through some of them. You're going to notice first off what I did was actually load up something called reset.css. Reset.css. Has anyone heard of that or anything like that? Yeah, what is it used for? Right. Right. So for Victoria, each browser, the answer we got was each browser represents styles slightly different. Therefore, we want to make sure that all the styles that are the same across all of our browsers before we start changing and adding on to them. So we use one style file that would just do that reset. And so here's a basic one. I got it from this site here. It's actually public domain. The license is public domain, so I get to use it for whatever I want. And it just goes through and see, it takes all of these tags, HTML, body, div, etc. You've got ordered list and unordered list in there. And it sets things like the margin and the padding and the border and the font size all to these initial values. So across the board, they're going to be the same. Whether or not it's Safari or Firefox or Chrome, we should apply the same styles first off. And then it goes through and it just does. The reason I use these is because I'm not expert. Someone else has done the hard work of actually comparing these things and figuring out what's different between them. And then creating a pretty basic reset. There are more complicated ones which we'll move into afterwards. So first I do is I reset my styles. This is what it would look like. So this is default. This is what would happen if we use just the user agent style. We can see down here the user agent. What's a user agent? Browser, right? User agent is browser. When, in this case, when we were making HTTP requests to GitHub, we had to provide a user agent. They needed that, right, as a client. So it's just sort of the client side. In this case, it's the browser. And the browser applies to paragraphs these properties, these CSS properties. And they apply to an ordered list, these properties. And we're noticing that all the styles that are on this stuff here, they're only coming from the user agent style sheet. Okay. If I reset it and try and do this equalization process, and now I reload this, that's what my page looks like. It looks like, sure, the browser tries to apply user agent style sheets, like a font size of 2 EM on the H1. But all my H1 is the same size, my H2 is the same size as my H3 right now, because my reset sets the font size to 100% for everything. Okay. So that's actually a good thing for me now, because when I apply my own styles, it's all based on that common look, right? So what these styles actually look like here, the style CSS file. In my body, I've got the name of the tag in this case, the body tag, or I can actually put more than one if I want. I can say H1, H2, H3, H4. They all get these properties. It's a bit of a shorthand. I can also apply some properties through something like this. So all of my headers, they all use this font. They all have this type of a margin. They all have the same line height. I don't know if that makes sense. But the H1 has a different font size than the H2 than the H3. Okay. You're going to notice, and no one's asked me yet what about this unit here? What's a rem? What's an m? There's a px and a percent and a vh and a whole bunch of different units that we can use out there. Pixels are a little bit old school. Our screens, this device has a different resolution than this device, the number of pixels per inch. So pixels mean different things on all these devices. Therefore, we need to use more relative values. And so EM is a relative value. So if I say that the font size is 2.4 EM, it's going to take the parent font size and then make this 2.4 times that relative to the parent size. Okay, that's the rule there. If I do an rem, that means that it's actually everything. This is 2.4 times the font size of my root element, which is, I guess, my HTML tag. And I think that's around 16 pixels by default. But if I up that, then all of my other stuff would also increase because this is just 2.4 times that. Using this relative stuff actually makes that type of design, responsive design, much easier. Use pixels this week. It's OK, because it can be really complicated to think about things in this relative nature. But ultimately, people that are good at CSS are thinking about this and using the right unit for the type of work that they need to do. Okay. Here I'm setting the font family. So across the board, everything that's within the body, unless it's later on given a different font, should use this font called Roboto. And Roboto is a font that I included here from Google Fonts. Okay. So with Google Fonts, I can just go in. Oh, there's Google's Roboto. Here's that font. And I say I want to, I'll deselect it first. I'll select it. It pops up down here. And it gives me this tag that I could use to import that. Right? So I've included that as CSS as well, but straight from Google Server. And so once I've included Roboto and Roboto Mono and Spectral and different weights, I'm saying I want the 400 weight and the 500 weight. This is like light and bold and that type of stuff, right? You can also put italicized if you want in here and load up the, because we don't want to download all of those different styles if we're only using one or two. That would be a waste of consumer resources, right? So we specify which ones we're actually going to use, and then later on we actually apply those to different entities. Okay, so Roboto, what does this mean? Why would I have, if I've got a font Roboto, why would I, give it multiple options here? Okay, cool. Yeah, so let's say that there is no font applied, or if Google fails to give us that font, we don't load it. We want to default to just any old sans serif font. Okay? And the reason why I put sans serif here is because Roboto is a sans serif font. But this might give us a different font, Arial on Windows, or maybe Monaco on Mac OS. Who knows? I don't know exactly. Maybe it's, I don't know if Arial is on Mac OS. Who knows, right? But the thing is, it'll just choose the default sans serif font and apply that instead. So the document will look relatively similar, right? If I get rid of Roboto here, I'm going to save this. And now I'm going to reload this document. So keep your eye on this font right here. This is the Roboto font. Little bit different, but not enough for us to care, right? So we do give it these defaults. And we do it as well for this other font. So my headers, that's this stuff up here. I'm using a font called Spectral. And that font uses a serif. It's a serif font. So I'm going to use a default of a serif font. This would be Times New Roman or Georgia or something like that on whatever device you're on. A serif, it's this stuff here. It's this little like kind of thing poking out the side of it, right? You got it up here on the B and down here, and on the X's you've got it. Whereas if we go down here, we're going to notice that there are no unnecessary little decorations on the font, and so that would be a sans serif font. That's the difference between serif and sans serif. Okay. You've also got monospace fonts. So when I want to actually show code, I want to make sure I'm showing it monospace so it's easier for you to read. This would be kind of a nightmare if I said that it was a sans serif instead, right? Oh, that's kind of gross. Now it doesn't align properly. So I instead choose But I want Roboto Mono because it nicely goes with the rest of my Roboto, except it just every character has the same width. But if I don't have that font loaded, then use a monospace font. Maybe it'll be Courier New or Andale Mono or whatever on Mac. I don't know. There's lots of different fonts out there. So we can also apply a font's weight if we want, using a font weight property. And here I'm actually applying it to both the pre-tag and any span that has a code class. Okay, so you're noticing that I was able to apply CSS to specific tags, many tags if I want. But I can also be a little more specific and say, pre-tag, that's a tag. That would be the tag that wraps up my code blocks here. See, pre. But I could also, sometimes I want to apply that same style to spans that have a class of code. Okay, so this is a span tag, and it has a class of code, which means that in my CSS, I say that it's a span tag, dot means class, code. And I could even say span dot other class if we wanted to. And I mean, if I wanted to apply to all of the classes, didn't matter what tag it was applied to, the class code, then I would just remove that tag prefix to it. So we can actually combine these names to be as specific as we need to. We're going to talk about specificity this afternoon. It's not really for right now. Okay? So I'm able to target elements, either generally or a little bit more specifically. I've also got, what else in here? Yeah, so both of my ordered lists, they're going to have the same padding. Padding means, anybody know? Let's take a look at this. My ordered list. Oh, I need to, oh, it's up there, that's fine. There we go. My ordered list here. See that green? Sorry for the people that can't see that, me pointing. But there's a green section where the 1 and the 2 are, right? And that's the padding. That means that my content is being pushed in away from the edges of the content box that we're in. It's being pushed away by a certain number of certain value, a certain measurement. And in this case, it's 1 rem, so essentially the size of our root font element. Okay. And the reason I like to do that is because if I up my font size at the base level overall, then that padding will also increase a little bit too, and will fit all the elements that it needs in there, right? So not a bad thing. Margin, what's margin? Right, it pushes things away from it. Yeah, it gives it. Yeah, so for Victoria, it's the space around it. As Taylor mentioned, we can see that here in orange. My element is here, but it creates a margin around the entire thing, pushing other elements away from it. Right. Okay. Do we have anything else we want to take a look at? See here, yeah, I've just forced this ordered list to be a decimal value here, but I could say disk. There we go. No longer an ordered list, even though it semantically says it is, right? Like I said, no enforcement. CSS and the HTML working together. It's a real dynamic duo, I guess. What else? We can apply colors. In this case, I'm using a hex value. This value can represent many, many different colors. 65,000 of them, I guess, right? Something like that. This, it really is just a way for us to represent. See these numbers up here? RGB 233, 145, 40. This E9 can be converted to the value 233 from hexadecimal to decimal values. Hexadecimal is like base 16, right? So I don't have time to talk about how to do that conversion, but a lot of our colors are encoded in this way. You could actually also do something like RGB 233. Oh, that gives us this little red color, right? So many different ways for us to do colors. I can do RGB values like this. I can do, like I said, hex values. If it's just, this would be the same as FFF, 6 F's? F's? Idiot. 6 F's. I can do shorthand too. If it's the same thing, it lets me do 3. I don't know why. I mean, I guess people are lazy, right? We're lazy. So different ways to apply colors. We just need a color value. I can also say orange. And there are things like this. Perry, is there a Peru? There's another one. Powder blue. There's another one, right? So lots of cool names. You can look those up if you want. I'm going to go back to what I originally chosen, which was this orange color. What else? Okay, we'll talk about what this is. I'm actually passing. We've got padding as a tag. It's not padding left or padding top. It's actually padding, and I'm giving it 2 values now. We're talking about how we can actually encode those and how we can use those for shorthand assignment of these values. Okay. This, we can talk a little bit about. This means here's an A tag, and here's an A tag that's been visited. Some of these tags or properties or selectors can have these kind of states applied to them as well. Okay. And then here's a center tag, can be used on any element. Just need to make the class center, and it will set the margin and the max width for me. That's what's actually making this thing centered in the browser because I don't want this document to span the whole width. It's too hard to read. I want it to be a maximum width and then scale down when I make the browser smaller, right? Might be nice to get some margin and stuff around that, but it's all right for now. Okay, so how do we feel about the basic style stuff? Is that okay? All right. Good? Okay. So cascading style sheets, we talked about that. The word cascading, what does that mean, to cascade? In maybe specific style sheets, or is there anything else that we can think of that cascades? Okay. Waterfalls, yeah, okay, cool, that's what I was looking for, right? Yeah, like, this is the idea. We got waterfalls. Waterfalls are the thing naturally that cascade. That means that you have a waterfall made with many different levels, and from the top of the water comes over, hits another maybe rock or some sort of a rock structure, and hits that, and then continues to flow over and flow over and flow over. And so you get this kind of cascading effect of the waterfalls. Maybe that's where they got the term for cascading style sheets. And the idea is just that any style that I apply to HTML, for example, the color property, will also be applied to anything inside the body. Will also be applied to anything inside the div and then inside the content, right? So here's sort of an example, right? We can say that the HTML, we're going to say that the background color is medium aquamarine. That's that nice little turquoise, I guess, or medium aquamarine if you want to be super accurate. The color floral white. Why white? Why just white? Now, floral white's nice off-white. Don't like to use pure white in my designs. I like to use slightly off-white colors. It's a little bit nicer, less contrasty, right? So that means that this part of the document, the HTML, has these styles applied. Well, if we notice we apply to the body just a border, the body still has the same background. The body still has the same color, and that's because these styles have cascaded from the HTML, its parent element, right? And then we keep going down and we actually apply styles to a div within the body, then you've got a different. We'll notice that the border actually isn't applied. That doesn't cascade. So some styles don't cascade. For example, the border. It might not. Not everything inside the border. Everything inside the body will have a border, but the body will have a border. But not each element inside will have a border. I guess that's not a cascading effect, right? But we apply maybe a different color, background color to a div, and a different color. That will take those effects. It'll override the styles that we're cascading from the HTML. And then we say, well, a paragraph inside that div has a different color, but not a different background color. It'll still inherit that color from its parent div. So there's an example that I have here under cascade.html, and we can just sort of, I guess we can bring that up. Oops. That's really just those styles applied to an HTML document, right? So we have our body. Inside the body, we have content. It has the style of. Here we go. The body has, well, first off, inherited from HTML. So HTML has a user agent style. That's the display block, which I'll talk about. But main thing is that the user agent is applying some styles to this. And then we apply our own styles, the background color and the text color. And then the body, we're seeing that the body inherits from HTML. The color, but not the background color. That's interesting. Well, I guess, yeah, the background color as well. But it's like, it's kind of transparent. It's actually transparent, but the color that we see is the one that's the thing behind it. Okay? The border of the body is set. And then inside of there, we have a div, and that div, it's actually overwriting the color now, the one provided through HTML, with its own value here, and it has its own specific background color just for within the boundary of that element. And then inside there you have another p tag, which has the color from HTML is overwritten by the color from div, which is overwritten by the color from p, right? So we can, if we're smart about this, we can put just some styles at a high level and then only overwrite the things that we need. And this is how we reduce the amount of style we have to write, amount of style we have to actually have people download. You imagine the bigger our CSS files, the more content people have to download. This makes our sites a bit slower. So as we get better at this, we want to use the cascading effect to our advantage. Is that cool? All right. Cool. Yeah, I went over all that. Okay. Oh, this is where I was going to go over defining styles. I already did that, right? We can use the link, we can use a style tag, or we can provide a style element to an element, or style attribute to an HTML tag. Okay. So this is where I want to talk about boxes. And then I think we'll have, yeah, we're going to have a break after we talk about boxes. Okay. So everything in CSS they call it the box model. That's why this whole thing starts off as the box model here. That's the subtitle. CSS, the box model. I want to try and explain to you what that means to be a box model. Everything is boxes. All H1 tags, all LIs, all ULs, everything's a box. We go back to our original document here, and I'm going to remove these styles, the ones that I applied. And I'm just going to show you that if I go down here, I've got this little piece of code right here. And it's a little bit, this is tomorrow's work, really, where we do document.createElement, document query select. This is us modifying the DOM programmatically. So this is what we can use JavaScript for. There's an interface that we can use. We can make JavaScript calls, and those JavaScript calls turn into DOM events or elements or modification. What this is doing is it's going to create a style element. So that means a tag that says style. We're going to be able to see that added. It's going to find the head tag, the one that exists already, and it's going to append that style tag to the head tag. Right? Remember I was typing style in there? This is going to do that for us through JavaScript instead. And then we're going to change the contents of that style tag to include a style that applies to absolutely everything, an outline, solid 1 pixel border. Okay. Why would we do that? It's probably easier just to show you the effect of it, and then it becomes a little more clear why we do it. In the console, I can type JavaScript, right? So I'm going to paste this JavaScript, and I'm going to hit enter, and now we're being shown the box model. Every single element now has a 1 pixel solid red outline. And we can see that the elements, that the nav, it has its own red line around it. And the main, it has its own red, and then inside of there, the H1 has its own red. So this actually shows us all these boxes that wrap up these elements, the boundaries of our content, right? Okay. And the way that we use the box model, we have different things that can affect the size of an element. So one thing is the content. If we hard code the content, we set a width and a height, well, it'll be whatever width and height we set, 100 by 100, that's fine. But sometimes we don't set the content. For example, you'll notice we don't set the size for this LI right here, but it's 724 by 36 pixels. And the reason why that is because that's how much the content needs. And this box grows based on the size of the content. This paragraph, same deal. This header, same deal. They're all taking up the entire width of the page. We'll talk about block and inline elements and why that is. But everything's a box, and the sizing is first affected by the content, or if we set properties that affect the size. Then, after that, the sizing will be affected if we want to add padding to our content. So we want to put maybe a border either on one side or all sides or a combination of 2 or 3 sides up to us. That padding pushes content from the outside in. It affects the size of the overall element, though. Okay. And then after padding, we've got the border. So we can put a 1 pixel, a 20 pixel, a 400 pixel border if we want around something. And that also affects the size of these things, right? As we add padding to our content, as we add border to our content, we affect the size of that box. We have margin. Kind of affects the size of the box, but not really. It's more about it affects the layout, though, right? It's not just the size, but also the layout gets affected by these. Because if I can only fit one thing on this line, then the next thing's going to drop to the next line. The margin may be affecting that. If I make the margin fill out the entire width of the browser, then the next thing in my list of HTML is going to drop to the next line. Okay. So content, padding, border, and margin. These are all really important things we have to understand in order to manipulate this box model that we have to deal with. Make sense? All right. And this thing, I've colored it and tried to be, it's just this that we're seeing here. The orange is the margin and the blue is the content. And if we go down here, we can see the same sort of representation here saying that this is the size of our content and that there's no padding, there's no border, but there's a 13 pixel margin above and below it. And any element that we choose here, that thing on the right side, as we go down the list here, it's changing based on which element I'm selecting. So we get an idea of the sizing of these things based on that. Okay. Oh, weird. Look at these little ones here. There's a link, an A tag, just kind of embedded in there. It's its own box. So, I think, let's make sure. Right, I talked about the syntax already, so we have the ability to style something, so we can apply properties to elements. We talked about that. These are called rules. These things that we're seeing on this page, these are CSS rules. And you've got the terminology we want to use. We would say that the, is there a good name for it? This is sort of this is a declaration of a rule. We've got properties. Properties are separated by semicolons. That's the rule. That's sort of what we have to follow here. I'd already shown you that you can have commas, so H1, comma, H2, H3. I think that's all good. Talk about the box. All right. So padding here. This isn't just about padding. It's about padding and margins as well. And actually, you can apply this to, I think, the border. You can have border top, bottom, left, and right if you want. So here, I have two different ways to say the same thing in CSS. I want my nav to have a padding of 100 pixels around each edge. And so I can say that I want the padding top, the padding right, the padding bottom, the padding left to all be, each be 100 pixels, and that would do it for me. But if I want the equivalent padding around the whole thing, I can use a shorthand. I can say that I just want the padding to be 100 pixels, and I'll just apply it to all edges, for me, right? And then it starts to get a little bit weird because we could apply just different padding to the top and bottom from the left and right. That's what I'm doing here is I'm saying that the top and bottom each have 100 pixel padding, but then the left and right, they have 200 pixels of padding. And so if I want to use this shorthand, I can now give it two different values, and they have to be in this order. It'll be the top and bottom values first, and then the left and right values. Okay. And I can take it even farther. I do 3 values here. Well, now it gets a little bit more confusing, although it does make sense, I think, when I lay it out like this, right? That we want the bottom to be a little bit different, 300, okay? But the left and right, they still are 200, so we can have them as the second value, and the first value is still that top one. We want all 4 values to be the same, and we don't want to do padding top, padding left, padding right, like we do on the have up here. We do them in that order. Okay. Does this make sense, right? How do we remember this? Yeah, oh, that's a good thing. Yeah, we just saw this, right? We go, start at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So clockwise from the top is one way to remember it. Another way? Oh, if I not fix that, let's fix that. Oh, it's gross. A little bit smaller. Better. All right. So TRBL. This is the acronym we'll use to represent top, right, bottom, left. And just if you remember this, then you know the order, right, of all these things. Padding is the example. You can do the same thing with margin. It works the same way. Can you imagine if margin you had to go counterclockwise or something? It'd be insane. Like, glad they're not stupid. So TRBL, and you can also just do this thing. Top left, or top right, bottom left, and yeah. Or look it up. Right? Okay. So that takes us to block line and inline, or block level elements and inline elements. Let's take a break here. It's a good place to stop before we get into some more of the details of the display properties that are really gonna, they make this a little bit hard. This is what makes CSS a bit harder. Adding colors and fonts and stuff, that's super easy, right? Making documentation is quite easy. But then we have to start thinking about how do we do layout? How do we actually create applications and layout? And then this is where that starts. So any questions? We're good? Okay, I've got time. No? Okay. So we'll take a break. Victoria will take a 5-6 minute break, 10-minute break at the most. But please let me know when you're back, Victoria, and then we'll get started again. Glad humans don't work that way. I mean, close, but not that, like, Testing, yeah. All right, Victoria, can you hear me? Mic's back on. Hopefully the echo is not increased by the fact that I dropped the mic thing. All right. Make sure Victoria's here before I get started. All right, I need split screen. There we go. No echo. Awesome. Maybe it fixed it. Okay. So we've talked a lot about how we can create HTML. We can create our markup. How we can create rules in CSS and how we can apply those rules to different markup. We also talked about the box model. And so this box model plays into how we lay out our pages. Again, it used to be documents, so things looked a lot like this. Put that back. Things look a lot like this. That's a document, great. But what about layouts where you have, like this application here right now has a pretty interesting layout. I've got well, I've got all the Chrome stuff up here, so the address bar and stuff, and then I've got a column over here and another column over here, and I'm able to resize these columns, right, in this application. We want to be able to build, I get a new column in here, so based on the width of this thing. So this application it has a layout. And if I want to start to create layouts inside of my browser, I need to start thinking about these different elements and how to manipulate them to create layouts that they were never designed for in the first place. First thing we're going to do is learn about block level and inline. So these are two different display properties that we can put on elements. There are a number of different elements that exist for us already that have these properties by default. They're split into two major categories, the block level and the inline categories. The block level elements, what they do is they will sit on, they'll be placed into the layout, and then another block, and then they will push the next element down below it. So we're seeing that these things are kind of stacked vertically, H1, div, and p tag. Those are all examples of block level elements. And when we look at them in the browser here, we can see that a paragraph spans the entire distance. It doesn't allow me to put another block level element beside it, which happens to be this UL, which is going to be here somewhere, or OL, right? Here's another block level element, an OL. And within there, more block level elements, LIs. These things are stacking vertically. But then you've got situations as well where you put a link in here, for example. And a link is an inline element. And it is a child of this block element. So the block element spans the whole page. The inline element just takes up the space that it needs to show the text content that's in there, right? I don't have any input fields on here, and I don't have any input fields, and I don't have any images on here. But those are also inline elements. They fall into that category. Here are all the block level elements. Don't bother reading it. It's not there's no point. Just kind of showing you that there are lists of these things out there. In my documentation, there is this exact list that I copied and pasted into this slide that you can go and read. And some of the examples in here: div, all of the H tags, the header tags, li, main, nav, p, for paragraph, pre for pre-formatted, UL for unordered list. There's also video in there. There's ordered list. There's header, footer, all these different elements. The key, though, is that these are all block level elements. So we need to choose which element to use based on the context that we're in, right? Oh, no. Is that my font that's messed up? Like, what's going on here? Helvetica? What was it supposed to be? That sucks. Let's try this. Okay. So this paragraph is a block level element. Its background has been colored to display the paragraph's parent element. So this paragraph here, it's going to sort of start, if this is the only thing on the page, it's going to start in the top corner. It's going to span the entire width of the page, filling it with text. And if the line needs to break, that'll happen. Okay. So that's a block level element. That's kind of how it looks. You've also got inline elements. Like I said before, buttons, images, inputs, anchor or A tags, bold, italic. What else? There's some other ones in there. BR, so line break. That's kind of an interesting one. So all these tags here, they would be used if you want to put a number of different elements horizontally into a flow, into the flow of a layout. So it could look like this. Oh, God. I have to see if maybe a font didn't get installed or something like that. It didn't warn me about it, but basically all I wanted to do was make sure that this thing here was like showing roughly like I've got maybe I have that paragraph tag, which is a block level element, and then inside of there I want to highlight just a little bit of text. So I need to I need to put a tag around that text. In order for this not to sort of break down to another line, I need to make it an inline element. A block level element would not do that. If I did a div there, it would break it down by default to the next line. But using a span, which is very similar to a div, but an inline version, I can do that. I can wrap this inline element down here. Just imagine that this HTML, it was wrapped in a span tag, and then a different background was applied to it. That's what we would get for that. So this is kind of what would happen if I did a div instead, right? It's going to break me down to the next line, put some space around it, that kind of stuff. Take up the entire width. So span and div, inline versus block. Okay. We can nest block level elements. I can say that a paragraph has a div, or a div has a paragraph, or a div has a div has a div has a div. I can do that as deep as I want to go. What I cannot do is have an inline element have a child that's a block element. We don't do it that way. So I can't think of situations where that is necessary. But yeah, don't put a div in a span if a div is block and a span is inline. Don't forget, we can change these things. I can make a div tag inline very easily by just changing its display property. I can make a span block level if I want by changing its display property. We can use CSS to modify these things. It's just that these tags have a default value and a default display property. Okay. So I said these are the two important ones, block level and inline. So we've also got this thing called inline block, which kind of came, I think, as people decided they wanted their content to be inline, not to break things to the next line, but also be able to push content around. So inline elements don't really do that. They don't really have that effect on the text. Of course, will take its place, but trying to make those things different widths and heights. In order to do that, we might want to make an inline block element. So really sorry about this. Sorry that this is confusing, right? That they've done this to us. It has some of the properties of an inline and has some of the properties of a block element. So we will use that a little bit today as well. Okay, I won't go into floats yet. So I'm going to talk about box sizing quickly, and then I'm going to go, CSS resets, then we'll talk about layouts with floating. So how big is this box, roughly? Based on the properties, the rules that we can see, how big do we think this box would be? Width and height. $110, okay. Any other? 140, it's closer. 160, okay. And how do we get 160? Yeah. Right. Yeah, so in this case, I've started by saying the content is 100 by 100. So obviously it's 100 width and 100 height to start with. And then I add 20 pixels of padding to the whole thing, which means that I'm going to get 40 pixels added to the width and 40 pixels added to the height. And then I'm going to add a border around the whole thing, which adds another 20 pixels to the width and 20 pixels to the height. So I get 160 out of it, right? But I put a width and height of 100 in there, but it's actually rendering as 160, and that can be kind of confusing, right? If I change a single property called box sizing, and the default is something called content box, border box says instead, we're going to take the entire thing, including the border and the padding, and we're going to use the width and height. Whatever you set as the width and height, that is going to, the content will actually be smaller than 100 by 100 as a result of this. But this makes things a little bit easier to work with, and I recommend for your projects or for Tweeter to set your box sizing to border box. Now, I've done it to this one element to show that that's possible. But in practice, you might do something like this instead. Everything at the very top. Maybe this goes into maybe this is part of your reset. Who knows, right? You could download someone's reset and then modify, add your own stuff to it. There's nothing against that, right? So I could put this in my reset and say that I want every single element to use box sizing across the board, be consistent that way, and then now when I say that something has a width and height, doesn't matter what the padding is, doesn't matter what the border size is, the content's going to get switched in. Now, obviously that's a problem if I don't give myself enough space with the content, but it's necessary to kind of choose the right type of box sizing and then choose one and stick with it for the project. Does that make sense? A little bit? Okay. Just kind of something we have to, yeah. Up until now, I've been using reset.css, which was just that public domain reset that some Meyer guy did. There's normalize.css as well. This one is much more popular, I think. Hard to say that for sure. They got a nicer website. And here it says, normalize makes browsers render all elements more consistently and in line with modern standards. So here they're not just saying we want things to all be set to the same value, is that we want to, we want to just make, we want to normalize things, not just reset them. We want to make things all work actually the same. So this is saying they support Chrome, Edge, Firefox, IE 10+, Safari 8+, and Opera. So it's pretty safe to use this today for your development. And there's a few different ways to get it. You can use NPM if you want. That might be a bit more complicated. You could also just download it. See? Oh, I click on the button. It doesn't download to the CSS. Just shows it to me in the browser. Well, it's as simple as copying and pasting this into a file, or doing like a file save, right? So here's my reset. This is the one I'm going to use from now on. Has an MIT license, so it's quite permissive. I can use it. I would just keep this. I would be keeping this in my document. That's how we adhere to these licenses, is we provide attribution to those that wrote the code. Okay. So box sizing done, normalize done. That's the reset we'll use. So we need to start thinking about how we can do layouts. And so that means bringing this float thing into our vocabulary. This is unfortunate to me. I really wish I didn't have to teach this. This is the web designed for one thing and being used for a completely different thing, and us having to deal with the consequences of that. And that's why float becomes quite weird to deal with and to use. So this is going to be an introduction. when the web was designed for layout, layouts were documents were what we were laying out. And so headers, cool, images, eventually, awesome. We want to be able to place images in line with text. So we might be able to have something like the left side there where we have almost like a newspaper layout. An image goes in, and text wraps all around it. An image goes in, text wraps all around it. Not a bad way to read some documents. But people started building applications, and so they started to move more towards layouts like we see on the right here, where you might have what they call like multi-column layouts. So instead of just content being displayed vertically, which is what the web is designed for, we also have content that goes horizontally, so column-based stuff, right? We'd have maybe a layout with a video at the top of our page or a big picture, and then underneath that, 3 columns. Maybe it's our pricing plans or the features of our application, but they're stacked horizontally now. This type of layout is hard to do with just the basic CSS, so we have to introduce a little bit of work with the display properties, so whether or not we're using block or inline, and then if we can float elements, it's sort of a hack or a workaround to get some of this stuff going, to get these layouts working. There are much better solutions today. Flexbox. Learn Flexbox. I'm going to tell you float because it's required by Lighthouse Law for me to go through this lecture today and show you this stuff. It's also really good to understand how the web came to be where it is today. But our usage of float and our hacking of float led to things like Flexbox being designed and added to the browsers. And Flexbox is usable enough now, I think, across most of the browsers. Maybe IE11, there's still a few bugs. But for the most part, Flexbox usable in every modern browser. And that's how I would actually do layout today, is with Flexbox. Okay, so I've got an example. It's inside of the block float HTML that I have here. Let me start by loading that up. This is what it looks like. It's what it's going to look like at the end of this exercise. We'll notice here that we have these boxes that are now stacked horizontally. And when that's kind of nice, right? So if my page gets smaller, those things, they'd stack vertically instead. People could still read them. Okay. So this is where we're moving into. And I want to take all of this, we'll take all of this out. And I will take all of this out. And I will just start from scratch, kind of rebuild that up for everyone, okay? So, first thing we want to do, I'm going to create a div, and it's just going to be a box. So, there it is. No styles applied to it. Just apart from the ones that it inherits, right? The HTML might have some styles. Body definitely does. That's where we're getting the font family and the background color and the font size. So all of a sudden, a little bit of style is cascading down to this. And what I want to do is set up this box to perhaps make it a little bit more legible, put a border around it. So I'm going to do that with some CSS. And I'm just going to say that all of my divs are going to have a border. We'll make it 6 pixels, solid. This could be dashed if you wanted it to be, right? Or maybe double line, or I don't know, there's lots of different options. Look them up in MDN, right? Solid. And then I'm just going to take this color here and use it because it goes with my color scheme. I kind of like that. So now that div has a border around it. I'm going to bring up this inspector too because I like to really encourage the use of this thing. There's my box. How big is this box? It says it is 736 pixels by 48 pixels. That's what, oops, if I think bring this up, yeah, I can zoom in, right? So 736 by 48. Why is it 736 pixels wide? Yeah, that my window is, exactly. And this is a block level element, right? So it's going to span the entire width of the page. So it's going to have, so this width is going to change as I change the width of the page. Now this is 1374 pixels by 48 still. Okay, why is it 48 height? Well, let's try this first. Hold on. Let's comment that out. Before it's 48 height, it is 36 height. What tells it to be 36 pixels tall? Okay, so how tall my content, how tall my text is. If I were to increase the font size, then the height of the box. So this is that content, that blue part of it is affecting the size of this thing. And we can see that, I mean, my font, I believe it is set to 2 rem. And I think by default, if I do 1 rem, or by default, I think it's about 16 pixels for the root level font. I think that's what it is. So I think that 2 rem would be about 32 pixels. But the height of this box is not 32, it's 36, but that's okay. There's like a little bit of space below and above, because if I needed a G, right, something like that, I need that baseline, so we do need to make sure that the font can fit in here. So you might not get the exact, perfect accuracy with fonts in particular. What happens when I now add this border back, and I go in here, and now it's no longer 36, it's 48. So that's a difference of 12. Why is it 12 pixels taller now? 6 on the top, 6 on the bottom for the border. Yep, remember we're affecting the size of this with the border. Cool. I'm also going to make the color inside, I'll just bring that up. Make that something that's legible so we can see the word box, right? Okay, cool. Now I want to actually have a box that is 200 by 200, and I want to have a few of them stacked horizontally. I want to create some columns in this layout. So I would probably want to give this a class called box, first off. And if I do that, then I can actually target that div.box and say that I want it to have a width of 200 pixels and a height, oops, that's not going to work, width and a height of 200 pixels. Okay. Look at that. Look at that margin. I didn't add a margin. We have a margin now. As soon as I set the width and height of that block element, it's still a block element, therefore it creates a margin automatically, an auto margin, the size of the rest of the window. That margin is going to be a different width based on how big this window is. And that's what's going to encourage, when I add more boxes, it's going to encourage them to drop to the next line. These are block level elements. So that's how they behave. This box spans the entire width, so this box can not be on that level. It has to go to the next level. Next one, right? Just keep dropping. Okay. So I want to also perhaps give these things maybe a margin, maybe a border, or some padding. So I'll do that here. I'll just say padding. Just put it 20 pixels around the whole thing, and the margin, I'll do 10 pixels, which kind of gives us 20 pixel space between. Actually, it's keeping them at 10 away, even though these both have the same margin. It's interesting, right? So I want to now make these things on the same line. So I'm going to give them, our first attempt at this is going to be using the float property. Okay, I can take this thing here. I can actually change temporarily. This is how I usually do my styles when I'm trying to figure this stuff out. Is I use this tool and I go and change them, and then I go into my code and I add what works after that. So if I'm thinking, well, actually, all boxes right now should float left, I can change that. But if I reload this page, I lose it. But I can go back in and I can say float left again, and I can see those changes. Right? So I'm changing it here, and I can see the effect of that immediately. I like that change. But maybe I don't want to apply it to every single box. So what I'll do is I'll create a div with a class float. I'll create a class called float, and I'll say that this is a float left property that's applied to anything with the class float. Make this a floating box. Make this a floating box. That's a bit weird. Maybe I'll make this a floating box too to fix that, right? Okay. So now all these things float. They've got their property. I can turn that off. These tools are so useful for this stuff. I definitely recommend. Play with it in here. Don't refresh. Copy and paste your stuff out. Refresh. Make sure it worked, right? This is the workflow that I recommend. If you just go in here, change, and then refresh. Sometimes I'll go through and I'll remove properties to see if the property doesn't even do anything. Because if it doesn't do anything, I should remove it from my CSS. Yes? Let's save that for the end. So the question for Victoria is, how do we center things vertically? It wasn't designed for it. It just wasn't. So you have to hack it up. And there are many different ways to do it. Flexbox is the best way. Now, or the grid. There's also CSS grid, which is less supported than Flexbox. Kind of, three strategies are float, turn to Flexbox. Flexbox, now you have grid, because Flexbox actually only has horizontal or vertical. You can either span stuff horizontally or vertically. And then if you use two flex properties, you can actually have it one thing that goes vertically, and then inside of each of the things that's going vertically, you can have them go horizontal, so you can kind of create that type of layout. But grid is all about is two-dimensional layout. So my recommendation is use Flexbox to make things vertically aligned, because you have like an align, align or justify content and align item properties, and you can say center, and then that would actually allow you to center stuff better. With the floats and with older CSS, it's such a hassle, and it's not even it's worth learning if you have to use it. But there's lots of great documents out there that show you how to do it, and so many different ways. And I have to choose the way based on sort of the context I'm in and what project I'm building and what the rest of the layout is doing, and kind of how supported I want it to be. Nowadays, that doesn't really matter because we don't care about IE 6 and 8 anymore. We only care about Internet Explorer 11, really. So that's what makes CSS hard, is just the consistency. Browsers are much better with it now. We can also use something called, caniuse.com. Can I use Flexbox? IE has partial support. There's some bugs present, that's what it says, but everything else is pure green. And it says here that globally 93.2% of browsers, plus maybe 3.4%, whatever, 96% approximately of the browsers out there support Flexbox, so we feel pretty safe in using that. Whereas if we say, can I use grid? No Opera Mini support. Again, some bugs with IE 11. More like 87%. So we're getting close on that one too. So I use this tool to figure out whether or not the feature that I want to use, whether or not my customers, my potential customers, would have broken layouts as a result of that. The recommendation I got from someone who's much better at this than me is if I want to use CSS grid layout, then what I do is I create a mobile layout and I create a CSS grid layout for everything else. And if the browser does not support the CSS grid layout, I deliver a mobile layout. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if it's desktop. Doesn't matter if it's just old. Just give them a mobile layout instead. And so I'd have kind of two layouts for that. Okay. I mean, you're talking about a small percentage of people, right? But you have to have some sort of fallback in that case. All right. So back to floats. I've got these divs. They're floating now. And that's kind of interesting because these are still block level elements. But now they're not pushing the thing down. And that's because when you float something, it is actually removed out of the layout. It's not affecting the other elements. Other floated elements it does, obviously. But if I take just a regular box here and not float it, it does not care that there was other stuff in this layout, because it's, when I float something, it actually floats above everything. Like, think about that. Lifting it up, everything still that is not floating is going to be laid out below it normally. Right? It's as if the floats aren't even there. It doesn't care about them.
Does that mean that if you're using something that's float, like your entire page has to be floating?
No, that's what we're going to fix. Yeah, but this is the part of the problem with float, is that it wasn't designed to do this, right? And so we have to come up with a way to make it so that sometimes we float, and the things that we do not want to float, we'll want to clear. Well, you want to use something called a clear fix to get past this. So one of the ways we could do this is we could say, I'm going to create a div. I'll give it a property called clear. Okay, so that clear thing here, it still falls victim to that same problem, is that it's still being rendered underneath the floated elements. And so what we want to do for that is say div.clear. This has a clear of left. I'm going to clear the left float. I don't know like where this all came from, to be honest with you. I hardly use it, but the idea is that a clear property would take anything, would say now this element, it's no longer floated. We're going to clear the left float. You can also clear the right float. That's another. You can float right to bring things over to the right side. You can also clear both if you want to be extra safe about it. Look what that does, right? We've got this div here now that clears the float, so everything after it it gets rendered properly in the layout now. So this is what we have to do. We have to do a clear fix like this. There are many different solutions for clear fix. This is one of them. I mean, if I didn't put anything in here and it's an empty div, and I didn't give it a, well, in this case, I could say border 0. It's not there, right? I mean, technically it's there. It has a 0 height, so it doesn't really affect anything, except it does the clear fix for us, so it clears the floats, therefore everything after it works just fine. I don't like the idea of putting these empty divs. Doesn't seem like a great solution to me. So we've got other options too. We could, I'm going to get rid of that border because I like to show it in there. I like to show off that clear fix that we put in. Like that. Okay. So another option is, and this is what you're going to see more common if you use something called grid-based layouts. This comes with, like Bootstrap has one, any of the CSS skeleton foundation, any of these CSS libraries that are popular out there, they have a grid system that they've implemented. And what this is it's a row and column based layout. We can say that we have a row, and inside the row we have a bunch of columns. Oops. So this might be a better way to do this, right? Because now we're saying we have this row, and inside the row, each box is going to be a floated box. Okay, so watch now. See how I have, with them being regular block level elements within the layout of the document, they're actually making their container, this div row, full width and height of what they need, right? We see the borders around the whole thing. But now when I reload this, what I did is I made the change where I now made these things float that are inside of it. All of a sudden, that row container here has a height of just the border. Because remember, these elements are brought out of the flow layout. That means that the container does not get resized based on their width and height. So we want to solve that problem too. What we do for that is the more common clear fix. And if I go and search for clear fixes, it's going to look a lot more like this today. We're going to use this sort of pseudo element, which I have no time to get into, but I've provided a link in the documentation. It's worth reading. The idea is that the div does have sort of these pseudo concepts of before and after. And so here I'm targeting the after of the row and saying that the content is empty. It's just what they told me to do. The display is table, and that we clear both floats left and right. So when I do it this way, now that container takes the size of the elements inside of it. Even though these are floated elements, this thing here, this row, has an after, and that after has its styles where it clears. So it's doing that same thing that our empty div was doing, but with a pseudo element, a pseudo after element instead. It's just I think a little bit of a cleaner way to do it. I like the idea of having rows and columns. If I wanted to have a bunch of rows on my page, I would actually break it down like this. I would say 2 rows, right? And just put them do it that way. Okay. So if your browser supports it, meaning, then I would actually I would prefer this because there's less magic. I can actually set the overflow of my row container to be automatic, to handle it automatically. If I go to caniuse.com, overflow, not overflow scrolling, yeah, overflow wrap, text overflow. That's good. This one scared me. This scared the shit out of me. So overflow, we want CSS properties here. Overflow, visible, hidden, scroll, and auto. These are all supported in effectively all browsers since IE6 plus Firefox 2, Chrome 1. So I'm pretty confident I could use this overflow property, and the clear fix is just something that I would have used like 7, 8, 10 years ago probably, right? That other clear fix. That's how old some of this stuff is, but I think it's worth talking about still. I'm going to, I'll just remove this one, and I'll put the div row overflow instead, and we'll see that, not there, it's somewhere in here, right? Same deal, it looks the same, except we're just using a more modern and descriptive property here. If I remove that overflow, we get that broken size again, right? Okay. I know I'm going a lot onto this, but this floating stuff I've seen, it gets you. It really gets you, right? That's why I'm trying to be clear on how the different tags relate to each other. Okay. So I've got this other option that I can use, which, remember I mentioned inline block? Okay, cool. Let's do inline block as well. Let's say that I'm going to take a regular box, put it down here. Maybe I'll give us another one as well. And now I'm going to actually give this a different display property. I'm going to say that the div inline is going to have a display property, not of block and not of inline, but of inline block. And so now it doesn't change this, but if I go in here and I actually apply that to here and to here, now we see it behave in that way. And I can apply this to all 3. And then any new boxes that go below it that are not in line, no clear fix necessary, right? So they're trying to solve these problems, but today Flexbox is the way we do all of this stuff. All right. Let's make sure clearing floats. The clear fix, yeah. Clearfix uses a pseudo element. That's where the link is. This is a topic that needs to be skimmed for now and then learn. The basics are well understood. Good. Pseudo classes, they fall into the same category. You have to learn on your own. A flexible alternative. Okay, we're getting pretty close to the end here. Right, we talked about float, and clear. Done that. That's sort of the end of most of the content that I had to teach this morning. We'll talk about positioning this afternoon. I'll give you a quick preview. Wow, this font. I gotta fix this font. Whoa, what did it do to me? Oh, this presentation has some missing fonts. That's what I was looking for. I need Poppins and I need Neutron. Let's do that. Like Poppins and Neutron. Sync fonts. I got Poppins in here. I'm sure Poppins. Probably what happened to my other one too. And Neutron, or Newton. I just downloaded those from the Google font page. So now when I load this up, it should be better. There we go. So we'll talk about position, specificity, and more specific layouts and how to do grid layouts. We'll actually use float to build a grid layout system. We'll talk about position, which is how things, this where all this stuff comes in, static, relative, absolute, and fixed. Kind of a pain in the ass. Then also, yeah, specificity, so how maybe the style we want applied to something is not actually being applied, but maybe something is more specific that's overriding it, so we need to learn how this works. And then grid layout with CSS, so talked about how we could design, do layouts similar to this here. Because once you can do this, then you can get a layout that looks like that, right? And this is what the web looks like today. Okay. Don't want to give away everything. Last little bit here. Right, so Flexbox, I've provided a link right here, 97% support. This is what, if you could use floats for your midterm project, for your final project, and if you're wanting to push yourself into CSS for your career, use Flexbox in your final project. Learn that. It's super important if you're going to be doing a lot of CSS. Here are some here where we can learn some more stuff. CSS Tricks is a great site. Lots of cool information here. It's been around for a long time. This is a page on the box model. It's kind of cool interactivity. You can like change values over here and see how it would be reflected here. Kind of a fun thing to do. You can write the CSS down here to kind of see how it affects the size. Learning layout. This is kind of useful. Learning CSS layout kind of walks you through different information about different layout options. What else? List apart. Lots of articles about more advanced CSS, good use of CSS, good architecture. Here's an article, Meaningful CSS, Style Like You Mean It. I mean, that sounds like that's for someone who wants to be a pro, right? So maybe what else? Let's see. CSS grid layout. So this is, again, a new feature. Allows us to create layouts more like this, which is really nice. But again, we're closer to like 87% support on that, so you got to know who your users are. BEM methodology. This is not a framework, but a sort of set of a methodology or a way to name your elements and name your CSS, set up your styles to be reusable, to be architected better. So this is actually, there's a few things like this. This one stands for, it's block element modifier. So you break your styles down into things that are blocks, things that are elements, and things that are modifying blocks and elements. Yeah, I wish I could get into this. My friend, though, does this stuff all the time. He says, teach them about BEM, and I wish I had the time to do it. So, if you're not going to care about CSS after this week, this section won't matter to you. You'll learn everything you need, pretty much, in today's assignments and stuff. But if you want to push it, start with these links. CSS float. There's a all about floats article. Still worth reading this, even though I've gone through this in pretty harsh detail, right? This is where I got a lot of the information that I used for the lecture. Was this here? I just tried to distill it down. So this link should be in the notes as well. All about floats right here, layouts with floats, all about floats, links right there. Definitely worth reading. And then the bonus, talked about this a little bit today, earlier. But basically, just how to find good search results. And so what this says is, instead of just choosing the first option that's W3 Schools, look for the one that's Mozilla Developer Network. Choose that. You're going to get better information. It's going to be up to date. Whenever you go to W3 Schools, it's all advertising. Chances are they scrape the content from other sites as it is and use that anyways. So yeah, consider that. And this goes for any searching that you do. Just because it's the first result doesn't make it the best one, right? You want to read the blurb, see if it kind of if you go to that link and it doesn't really give you what you want, you're going to want to look for some new ones, right? I think that's it. Does Victoria have any questions about that? Pretty quiet. How are we feeling today? Okay. And we know what to prepare for this afternoon. Again, position, specificity, and more complex layouts.
All right, thanks. I'll send out these notes. That was fun.